Today I'm replacing my converter charger in my 2017 Airstream 27 International with an aftermarket unit from Boondocker. Boondocker is a 4-stage converter and charger. This is the model BD1260HW. This was recommended to me as a replacement for my standard Parallax model 5300 that Airstream includes as standard in its models before the year 2018. In my Airstream, the converter and the fuse board are located just to the left of my stove and below my storage. To access the panel, you simply twist the knob, pull down the board, and that exposes the Airstream's electrical system. To replace the Boondocker, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to remove the cover of the circuit breakers by removing these two screws. In some of the models, they don't use screws, they actually use rivets, so you have to drill the rivets out and re-rivet them. But luckily for me, these are very simple to remove screws. The second thing we're going to do is we're actually going to remove this entire housing here by unscrewing the 4 screws over here. Also taking the door off by these really simple to remove screws. There's 2 screws that hold the fuse board on, which we're going to remove the fuse board and just put it off to the side while we take the actual box, the chassis, out for the old converter. So before we begin, there's obviously 2 key safety components. We're going to remove shore power, which is why I've got this shop light here that I've plugged in from my shop for light. We're also going to disconnect both positive and the negative on the batteries. Obviously, anytime you're playing with an electrical system here and then you come across the voltages that are present in here, you've got to take safety precautions. All right, let's go ahead and start a removal. First, we're going to pull the thumb screws off that hold the cover. And we're going to remove the panel. Set that aside with thumb screws. Then we're going to take the AC cover off. Then we're going to take the 4 screws that hold the converter chassis off. We'll take the cover off of the circuit breakers, give you a sense of all the fun that's going on in there. And then next we're going to take the fuse board off and pull that to the side so that we can begin pulling the chassis out. Okay, I've pulled the screws off that hold the fuse board. Just to let you know, on this one there was a nut on the back of this particular board. It looks like it passes through, the bolt passes through here into this nut and then also into the hole back here. So you're going to want to, the nut dropped off, you want to go ahead and put that to the side, and you can see the board just sort of swings away. We're going to leave all of the connections here connected, and we're going to disconnect only 1 wire that we need to for the converter, which is the DC positive wire right here. And you'll notice also out of the converter is a negative wire, which connects at the very top of the ground rail up here. So we're going to use just a standard flathead screwdriver and remove that. And what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and, here, as you can see, I can pull the chassis out just a tad. That wire comes to the converter, and we're gonna pull that around here, and there's your 2 wires coming to the converter. And you're gonna want to wrangle all of your other bundle of wires out of the top here of the chassis. And there's your fuse box board, which you can set off to the side like I've done here. Okay, so I've undone the wire nut and removed the common line. We're going to go ahead and take just the line off of this 3-wire bundle here that was in the wire nut, and we sort of pull both of these out. And we should have, except for the ground, the chassis ground, we should have all of the wires disconnected from the chassis. Now, surprise, surprise, it looks like there are no specific chassis ground wires. So we're going to go ahead and fashion a chassis ground wire using some spare additional wire that I've got, which I'll run to the common ground right over here on one of the additional ones. Okay, I've got the chassis on my workbench, and you'll get a sense of the size of the Boondocker relative to the chassis. So we're going to go ahead and take the top cover out of this chassis, mount the Boondocker inside, and then to do that we're going to have to take the guts out of the chassis and reuse at least these 2 wire components to connect back to the fuse board. You'll see that the top plate of the chassis has rivets on the top, so we're going to drill those rivets out, and then I'll probably try to improvise with some sheet screws unless I can score up some rivets of my own. Okay, I've drilled out the rivet heads. I left one on just so that I could at least swing the cover back in place if I didn't have sheet screws, and this shows you the inside here. We'll take off this particular cover. The 2 wires that we're going to try to reuse are the DC positive and the neutral wire here, which we'll disconnect from the circuit board. And what we're going to have to do is unscrew and remove the fan chassis, and then also the mounts that hold the circuit board in place. Okay, the chassis for the old Parallax is held in place by several of these T15 torque sockets, so we're going to take those out, and then there are a few plastic screw pegs that go ahead and secure it into place, so we'll just pop those out after we've had a chance to remove these T15 screws. Okay, we've got the circuit board little plastic rivets popped, so the circuit board can almost come out. There's only 2 remaining components. First is the fuse blades for the old Parallax converter. Those come out via sort of 2 screws on the front, and then you've got the grommet here to pull the wires out. I'm going to go ahead and reuse these 2 particular wires, and I don't want to go ahead and pull them out anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip them with a set of wire snippers here and here, and be able to go ahead and reuse them to attach to the Boondocker. Okay, I've snipped the wires. I'm going to go ahead and remove the chassis and the fan from the old chassis there, and now what we have is a perfectly empty chassis, and we're going to go ahead and take the Boondocker, see if we can mount the different screws that go there. The 2 wires that we saved, the positive will come over to this side, the negative will come over to this side. You'll have to strip and bare those, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fashion a chassis ground wire that will come out of here, come out of the front, and then attach to the common chassis ground. The Boondocker didn't match any of the existing mounting holes for the circuit board for the old Parallax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small Dremel tool, and I'm going to go ahead and flatten Dremel these little extruding metal supports for the circuit board for the Parallax. I'll go ahead and Dremel those off. We'll have a nice flat chassis, and then I'll go ahead and mount the Boondocker to the bottom chassis plate using some sheet screws. Okay, I've gone ahead and stripped the wires and reusing the blue and the white wire for connection to the DC section of the Boondocker. I had some 2 feet of ground wire that I went and go ahead and secured at an electronics store, and I'm going to use that and run that to a chassis ground. And now I'm going to mount the Boondocker inside the chassis using some sheet screws. Okay, I've completed installing the Boondocker in the old chassis, and I wanted to point out a couple things, just modifications that I did. The first is I kept the guard on the existing fan just to make sure that if we have any critters or mice getting in there, they won't be able to pass through this. I took the 2 screws that were here and I actually reused them down here to mount into the Boondocker. And then I took an existing sheet screw that I had and then mounted it here. I didn't do the 3rd one, mostly because I feel like this is relatively secure. It's definitely not moving around at all. The second thing I did was I reused the grommets. So I've pulled the grommets on over here, and I'll go ahead and pop that on when I'm done. The same here, this is a compression grommet, so I went ahead and salvaged that, ran the wires back through there and salvaged that. I had to stretch them just a little bit more to reach the back. And then in the ground wire here, this is the one that's going to be the chassis ground wire. I also kept the existing kind of rivet on there too, just to sort of act as a guide and just in case I didn't have any sheet screws, which I'm able to repurpose. And then lastly, when I did install those screws, they definitely stuck out a little bit more. So I took a Dremel tool and I went ahead and ground off about 1/4 of an inch that was protruding from both of those. That way the chassis can be kind of nice and snug. So the chassis is ready to go. We're going to go ahead and install it back and then start connecting the wires. We're going to go ahead and slide the chassis in. And we'll start connecting our wires. What we'll do first is we'll mount the fuse board back into its original strips. We'll take the ground wire and run that back here and reconnect that to the ground up here. There's plenty of room. And then we'll take the blue wire and connect that to the fuse board before we go back and look at our AC wires. Okay, to clarify where we ran for our DC. So we ran our DC positive from the Boondocker's positive to the DC positive here. We ran the DC negative from the Boondocker all the way up to the DC negative here. And then we took our chassis grounding wire, which I sourced from an electrical store, just a spare bit of zip cord. Mine was red and black, but you probably want to use maybe gray if you're following standard schemes, and then ran that to the common grounding rail here. Now we're going to go ahead and manage our AC wires. Okay, we've completed our AC wiring. We'll go ahead and follow where that is. Remember, we had 3 strands coming out here, 2 black. The first black I wired into the pigtail here. The second black I wired to the common line here, and doesn't matter which one is which. They're not in polarity. And then the green wire I went and wired to the common AC rail. So looks like we're wired up correctly. I'm going to go ahead and put the chassis mount screws back on, and we'll go ahead and connect her up and then test her out. So we have a completed installation. And there's just one thing that I learned as I was putting the breaker cover board back on. The breaker cover board has an indent here, and what it does is it actually goes right flush up against the piece of metal that separates the DC side from the AC side. So what I did was, if you recall, behind this cover is a open grommet and an open hole, is I really carefully fed the 3 wires and the ground wire through that grommeted hole. It took a little longer than I expected, but that allowed me to flush mount the cover, and away we go. So there you go. Hope you find this video helpful.